Okay, hello everybody. If you are tuning in, we are moments away from beginning our afternoon program for the Emily Dickinson Museum. So thank you for your patience for just about 30 more seconds. And our webinar attendees are just now joining us. Welcome all. Always fun to watch that number jump, jump, and jump. Okay. Welcome everybody. We're so glad you're tuning in with us. We are about to begin our program Summer in the Poet's Garden with Marta McDowell. And I'm going to offer a few words of welcome, and then we'll be hearing from Elizabeth Bradley with an introduction of our wonderful guest. And I think I'll go ahead and get started and thank you all. So welcome. We're so thrilled to be here with you on this rather dreary day in Amherst. But I think joining up with Marta and with you is going to help us bring us all back to summer days in Emily Dickinson's garden. So while the museum is currently closed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been absolutely wonderful to hold remote events like this one and to find that we have participants tuning in from all over the world. We are joined today by over 300 individuals, and we just feel that this is further evidence that Emily Dickinson is ever more relevant and present in our world and speaking directly to us today. My name is Brooke Steinhauser. I'm the program director at the Emily Dickinson Museum, and we want to thank you for tuning in this afternoon. If this is your first program with the museum, I offer you a special welcome, and I recommend that you check out our other program offerings when this is over. You can find that information on our webpage at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. We are busy trying to churn out opportunities for you to engage with the museum in this time of closure. So in a minute, I will introduce Education Programs Manager Elizabeth, who will welcome our esteemed guest speaker, Marta McDowell. But before I do so, I'll just mention that we can neither see or hear our wonderful participants in this webinar, but we do feel your support, and we thank you for being with us. There will be a time at the end for a question and answer session with Marta, and we would invite you to participate in that using the Q&A function. So if you are in the webinar and you go down to the bottom of your toolbar, you'll see the little dialogue boxes that say Q&A. So that's how you can send either words of affirmation for our speaker, or you can pose a question to her when the time comes. And Elizabeth will be facilitating that after Marta's presentation. We are also streaming this event live on Facebook, so those following along there should leave comments or questions there on the live stream, and we will do our best to address your comments or questions too. And our full program will last just about 1 hour, so we hope you've got your lunch in front of you and you're envisioning yourself enjoying that lunch outside in Emily Dickinson's garden. So at this point, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Bradley, and thank you very much.
Hello, I'm so glad to be with all of you today, and I'm very pleased to introduce Marta. So Marta has been a longtime friend of the Emily Dickinson Museum and its gardens. She's lent her talents as both a master gardener and a garden historian. In fact, if you visit the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, you can stroll the grounds with a landscape audio tour that Marta scripted. She's led several of the museum's garden volunteer days and served as our first gardener in residence in 2018. I also encourage everyone to pick up a copy of her book, Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, out from Timber Press in 2019. In addition to its lyrical writing, it is filled with gorgeous full-color illustrations of the museum's gardens. Marta McDowell teaches landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden and consults for private clients in public gardens. In addition to writing Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, she's also written the world of Laura Ingalls Wilder. She's the New York Times best-selling author of All the President's Gardens and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life. She's working on a new book about the secret garden, and its author, Frances Hodgins Burnett, which is out from Timber Press in 2022, and is the 2019 recipient of the Garden Club of America's Sarah Chapman Francis Medal for Outstanding Literary Achievement. So we are truly blessed to have her with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Marta.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Brooke. And welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, or whatever time it is for you. I am wishing that I was in Amherst on Main Street in Emily Dickinson's garden. But I tried to do the next best thing. First of all, behind me, you'll see some of the flowers that Emily Dickinson grew that I grow in my own garden. And I'm going to share a lot of pictures of the garden to give you a flavor. And we're going to go through this a special way using paintings from an Amherst, Massachusetts artist of Emily Dickinson's flowers and the garden, and also, of course, Emily Dickinson's poems. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll begin. All right, so I'd like you to imagine yourself at the Emily Dickinson Museum. You're behind the homestead. This was Emily Dickinson's home for all but 15 years of her life. She was born here and she died here. We're now behind the homestead. So to your right would be the kitchen. To your left would have been an old barn complex. It was really a very big barn. They had livestock and horses. And then straight ahead, then as now, there was the garden. So you would go down this slope. It stretches down this gentle hill. It's on the east side. It was very bright and sunny at the time. Now, as you can see, it's much more shaded. But again, think about Emily Dickinson, along with her sister, her mother, her brother, and her father as well, going into that garden. And here is Emily Dickinson herself. I'm going to start with just a brief quote from a poem. This doesn't count as one of our official poems, but it reminded me of today. And she wrote, "I tend my flowers for thee, bright absentee. My fuchsia's coral seams rip while the sower dreams. Geraniums tint and spot, low daisies dot. My cactus splits her beard to show her throat." I love that poem. That's just the first two stanzas. So here's young Emily Dickinson. She's probably a young teenager at this point, and she's holding a little bouquet of pansies. Now I'd like to introduce you to another gardener who works frequently with me at the Emily Dickinson Museum. This is Victoria Dixon, and she's a frequent volunteer and a good friend, and she is the artist that you will see during this program. So we'll start with Victoria's paintings of foxglove. In my garden, the foxglove are now going to seed, but you can see how they make these wonderful tall spires in the garden. And this painting, it's a triptych, shows the homestead in that pale yellow color with a green shutter. So you can get an idea of what the house would have looked like from down in the garden. This is foxglove, botanically Digitalis purpurea. Love that name, right? Digitalis. It sounds like digits, and it does look like little fingers of a glove. Purpurea, obviously for purple. Now, Brooke is going to read a poem that Emily wrote that includes foxglove in a beautiful way.
I taste a liquor never brewed, from tankards scooped in pearl, Not all the Frankfurt berries yield such an alcohol. Inebriate of air am I, and debauchee of dew, reeling through the endless summer days from inns of molten blue. When landlords turn the drunken bee out of the foxglove's door, when butterflies renounce their drams, I shall but drink the more. Till seraphs swing their snowy hats, and saints to windows run, to see the little tippler leaning against the sun.
As a gardener, I love this poem because this time of year, I'm really surrounded by pollinators. So bees, butterflies, little wasps, unusual little flies, hummingbirds. It's really a buzz. And I think in this poem, Emily Dickinson does a wonderful job of giving you that feeling of, at the same time sort of being one of those pollinators, but also experiencing them. And I will say that bees, when the foxglove are in bloom, they'll go up those flowers and buzz around like they really are a little bit inebriated. So here is another of Victoria's paintings. Here a little blow up, if you will, of that drunken bee coming out of the foxglove flower. Emily Dickinson, some of you I'm sure know, also collected pressed plants. So in addition to being a gardener and working as, in horticulture, digging, planting, weeding, all of those things, starting when she was a young girl, she started collecting flowers. It was a popular hobby, and then pressing them. We don't know whether she had a flower press or she did it in books, which I think is probably more likely. Sometimes now when I buy an antiquarian plant book, I'll find little dried flowers in them. So here is page 26 of the 66-page herbarium. And at the top right, there is a pressed specimen of the foxglove flower, that Digitalis purpurea, carefully glued down with little strips of paper. If you want to see images of the whole herbarium, you can go on the website for Harvard's Houghton Library. Now, this is not Emily Dickinson's garden. This is my garden. And because, as Elizabeth said, I write books about people who garden, I tend to add in flowers that they grew as well. And that is how foxgloves ended up in my garden, because they were favorites, not only of Emily Dickinson, but also of Beatrix Potter. If you want to grow foxgloves, they are biennials. So it means that the seed falls and it grows into a little green rosette in one season. Well, actually the following season. And then the next year you get the flower. So it's a good thing for me. You can't be too tidy. If you're a very tidy gardener and you mulch everything really solidly, they may not grow. So again, let them be a little wild. I will say they sort of put themselves wherever they want to be. So they come up in different places every year for me. I will also say that sometimes the best way to get a view of your flowers is by lying down on your back. So you can see those are the tips of my shoes that you are looking at. I will say that being kind of locked down in a pandemic, that's given me a lot of time to be out in my garden and stare up at flowers and clouds. And that is sort of the bee's eye view, right? And why wouldn't you go in there if you are a bee? Nature is an incredible thing. And so over time, the foxglove has evolved to have this sort of, they're like landing lights for pollinators. They say, come on in, we're ready for you. And there's the foxglove again, just to show you once more that lovely, lovely picture. And you can even see in this image that Victoria has created, there are different kinds of foxgloves. So if you love them, plant a lot of them. They are early summer bloomers. We'll move on now to daylily, the second of our flowers today. Emily Dickinson was especially fond of daylilies. She seemed to associate herself with them in a special way. We know this because her eventual editor, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, was introduced to her face to face at the homestead. And that night he wrote to his wife that Emily Dickinson had come in and handed him some red daylilies, saying, "These are my introduction." So she had red hair. In some ways, she was a person who took great risks. I think of daylilies as a very open flower and certainly a very brilliant color. This is Victoria's picture of the red daylily. Daylilies were very popular in the late 19th century when Emily Dickinson lived. She lived from 1830 to 1884. So you can imagine these being not sort of everyday plants, but really something kind of new at that time. And certainly Emily Dickinson's poetry was also something new. All right, I'm up to read this one. And here it goes. It bloomed and dropped a single noon, the flower distinct and red. I, passing, thought another noon, another in its stead, will equal glow, and thought no more. But came another day to find the species disappeared. The same locality, the sun in place, no other fraud on nature's perfect sum. Had I but lingered yesterday, was my retrieveless blame. Much flowers of this and further some have perished in my hands, for seeking its resemblance, but unapproached it stands, the single flower of the earth that I, in passing by, unconscious was. Great nature's face passed infinite by me. Now, again, as a gardener, I take great solace in Emily Dickinson's poetic words here, because I will say that many flowers have also perished in my hands. I do my best to take care of them, but sometimes they just don't last. Daylilies, as you might guess from their name, only last for a day. So any single bloom, you see this wilted one in Victoria's lovely painting, that was open and beautiful the day before. By day two, all withered. So it is one of those reminders that you have to be in the moment. And again, gardening is that wonderful connection to how nature keeps reminding us of this. And there is an orange daylily from my garden, along with a very interesting, this is a weed, this is bindweed. I remember, I think it was Emerson said, "What is a weed?" So sometimes they're pretty, but not in your garden. Emily Dickinson did battle with all sorts of weeds. So I take comfort in that as well. And here's a daylily at the Emily Dickinson garden. This is a favorite of mine. This is Callus Citronella. It's the lemon, so-called lemon lily, and it does smell like citrus, not like a citronella candle. It's an old garden variety. We try to keep as many of those in the garden as possible so that the things that we're growing, at her time are growing there now. There I am with another volunteer, and you can see us actually among the daylilies. And actually, if you look at the bottom of this picture, you can see some of those spent blooms. So you see the buds, they'll be open probably the next day, maybe the day after. The open flowers, gorgeous, only last a day, and then the spent blooms. Also around us, there are rhododendrons in great need of pruning, which they've all been pruned out now. And there's some lilies in the foreground. And that big tall white thing is valerian, which is a sort of herb, a natural healing medicine. Oh, on to daisies. So Emily Dickinson did style herself as a daylily, but she also sometimes called herself Daisy in writing letters. She would occasionally sign herself Daisy. In this painting that Victoria did, there's a mix. So there's the white ones are daylilies, ox-eye daylilies, and the yellow ones are black-eyed Susans. And so again, these appear in her garden. They appear in her herbarium as well. So you can see these little ox-eye daylilies. Here's a lovely field of them up in Amherst. I was going out and picking flowers. We were doing actually a herbarium workshop to see how she would do those pages. The daisy now is Leucanthemum vulgare. It's not vulgar, it means that it is the wild one, but this is the imported ox-eye daisy. It came in from Europe and now naturalized around North America. So at the bottom of this is page 8, you see Emily Dickinson crisscrossing two of these daisies, which in her day had a slightly different botanical name. And I always think of this almost as a shield, like it's like her coat of arms. I think that this is a very beautifully arranged page and that she spent a lot of time on it as well. These are actually not daisies. They are daisy-like flowers. So this is actually a little white aster, but Elizabeth sent me this picture from the museum and I wanted to include it because you'll notice this bee, it's a honeybee, and it's got its pollen baskets full. If you look at the leg, it's just totally covered with pollen. So that bee is extracting nectar, but it also is collecting pollen that it will bring back to the hive. And all of the daisy family is very good for these kinds of pollinators. And if you think about it, right, they're very flat at the top. And actually the real flower is all that little yellow stuff in the middle. It's actually made of, you know, dozens, hundreds of tiny little flowers. And then the outer things that we call petals are really something else. But not to get too technical, just know it's a perfect plant for so many pollinators. And again, that's true of this whole family of flowers, asters, daisies, and oops, wait a minute, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so that you can see another one, which Emily Dickinson grew, and that is zinnias, right? Same family as the daisies and the asters. And again, all of those little things in the middle, there's an older one, those are all little individual flowers. So it's really quite extraordinary. How do we know what Emily Dickinson grew? Well, in many cases, she wrote letters and she mentioned them. And she once wrote a letter saying something to the effect of, you know, I am going to send you a zinnia from my purple garden. Okay, so we're back to screen share and we will go on to the next one. So daylily, daisy, rose. Now, she didn't call herself Rose, but of all flowers, the highest number of mentions in letters and poems. How do I know this? It's because I counted them all with the help of concordances, I should add. But rose, the rose flower or roses are the most frequently mentioned flower. Summer is for roses, particularly June. So here we have the three Dickinson children, Emily and her siblings. Her older brother, Austin, William Austin, they called him Austin, and her younger sister, Lavinia, or Vinnie. Emily Dickinson happens to be depicted here with a rose and a book. Again, the portrait painters at the time, I think they sort of did these up as standard, but there's her red hair. So I think he worked hard on the likenesses. I assume it was a he, maybe it was a she. The rose. So here is Victoria's rose, this lovely red rose. And here is one that we know she grew in her garden because her niece, her brother's daughter actually wrote down a nice list of the roses that they grew. This is the blush Noisette. I wish that we had a scratch and sniff function in the webinar, because these are the most fragrant roses. They just are absolutely wonderful. And we brought this back to the Emily Dickinson garden. It's done really well. And Elizabeth, you're going to read this one, right?
Yes. Would you like summer? Taste of ours. Spices? Buy here. Ill? We have berries for the parching. Weary? Furloughs of down. Perplexed? Estates of violet. Troubled never looked on. Captive? We bring reprieve of roses. Fainting? Flasks of air. Even for death, a fairy medicine. But which is it, sir?
So always a cure from the garden. And I particularly like that idea of a reprieve of roses. Now, this rose is what the Dickinsons called the calico rose. And it does sort of look like a printed fabric. Its official scientific name is Rosa gallica. So I think that was just sort of morphed into calico. But isn't it amazing with these striped petals? It looks like someone has taken a paintbrush and painted each one of them. Now, roses recently at the Emily Dickinson Museum got a big boost when they were redoing the bedroom and moving some doors and things that had gotten moved during the years after the Dickinsons lived there. They found underneath the molding a tiny little piece of the old wallpaper, and it's been reproduced, and here it is. When I first saw the bedroom, probably 25 years ago, it was a kind of dull paisley. It was sort of beige and white. It was not unattractive, but it looked like, you know, someone who wore a white dress and only stayed inside. This gives you much more of an idea of a person who loved a garden and particularly loved roses. So we can't be in the bedroom now and visit, but I can show you a nice picture of it. This is a snapshot I took, so the quality isn't great, but I wanted to show you the trellis. So we planted that blush Noisette. It was a tiny little twig from one of the antique rose vendors. They mailed us this little stick. We grew it on, and then we put it in the garden, and all of a sudden it really started getting big. So we needed to give it some support. So we put in this little pyramid or tutor, and then, you know, gave it a year or two, and look at it now. So it's just magnificent. It keeps on blooming through the summer, and I wish I was there right now to give it a big whiff. Again, I want to keep making plugs for garden volunteer days at the Emily Dickinson Museum. We have a lot of fun. It always needs some extra help. Amherst College does a really good job, you know, sort of on the regular lawn and edging, but the garden beds always need a little extra oomph. And we have a really nice group that gets together periodically to do that. So we're going to move on now to a plant that vines. This is a close-up. Again, it's just a little detail of a flower, but this is clematis or clematis, depending on who taught you how to say it. And I do absolutely love this poem. And I think, Brooke, you're going to do this one, right?
Yes, indeed. Okay. 'Tis customary as we part, a trinket to confer. It helps to stimulate the faith when lovers be afar. 'Tis various as the various taste. Clematis, journeying far, presents me with a single curl of her electric hair.
I dearly love the image of electric hair, because if you look on the left side of this picture, of the Jackman clematis or Clematis jackmanii, you will see the developing seed pods. So after the petals fall, the purple petals fall, that middle part matures into the seed. And as they dry, they curl back and they do look electric. It's really wonderful. Now the clematis in this picture is growing up the side along the trellis. And where these two volunteers are standing, and they've stood up, they were actively working, was the old conservatory. And so this is pre-2014. You'll see in a minute why, and we know it's post-1914. Emily Dickinson's father put a little glass room, a conservatory, onto the house in, I think, 1854. I think I've got that right. And it was attached where the window is, underneath the window that's next to the woman with the handle, the tool handle. You can see the bricks are different. That's where the door was. That goes into her father's study or library. And the windows to your right, those are the dining room windows. So Emily Dickinson called this my little garden off the dining room. And she absolutely loved the conservatory. Here it is, newly restored in 2014. It's very exciting because now it's full of the plants that she grew there. We know that she loved geraniums. She talks about pressing plants, pressing little geranium leaves. And it's a very wonderful fragrant plant. Again, popular at the time, all of the scented geraniums as well as the flowering ones. And we're going to have now a poem read by me. I'm showing you, this is in the Amherst College Library. It's one of Dickinson's manuscript poems. So it's actually written in her handwriting. And here goes the poem. Bloom is result. To meet a flower and casually glance would scarcely cause one to suspect the minor circumstance assisting in the bright affair, so intricately done, then offered as a butterfly to the meridian. To pack the bud, oppose the worm, obtain its right of dew, adjust to the heat, elude the wind, escape the prowling bee. Great nature not to disappoint, awaiting her that day. To be a flower is profound responsibility. So again, you get the idea that she also encountered, pests and diseases in her garden and really had to work sometimes to get her flowers to bloom. And I think, again, she sort of styles herself as a flower with profound responsibility. Here's the interior of the conservatory, again, now restored, showing a lot of the plants that she mentions in her letters and poems. And, oh, I guess this is actually a picture from before that. So again, just showing the side. To the left is where the conservatory is right now. All right, I think, Elizabeth, you're going to do the last poem, right?
Yes. My garden, like the beach, denotes there be a sea, that summer, such as these, the pearls she fetches, such as me.
And don't they look like pearls? Or maybe her poems were her pearls. But at any rate, I love that image of the garden like the beach and the sea rolling in with the flowers. Again, come join us when garden days are back in session. We have a really good time. I'm in the middle. You can see with my I'm Nobody t-shirt. Carl from Amherst College is there, and a bunch of my good friends who have come at various times, and in some cases, real regulars. And if you're out there, hi. Oh, and we do miss the cat. So the cat has moved. This was a neighborhood cat that was dearly beloved, and would always come and sun himself, or in this case, sit in the shade, which we'll all need this weekend if you live in this area. We miss you, cat. I just wanted to show you a few more of Victoria's paintings. It was really hard to choose among them, so these are among the ones I didn't show you. She is really an accomplished watercolorist, and she does all of these poems to interpret Emily Dickinson's poems, Gardens and the Flowers that she loved. With that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Elizabeth and Brooke to do the Q&A. And, you know, I wouldn't be a real author if I didn't say yes, buy my book. And please support the Emily Dickinson Museum. Thank you.
Right, Marta, we have a lot of questions rolling in for you. That's fantastic. And I'm just going to pick from them. So I have a question coming from Diane. How did she incorporate her garden into her baking? Did one inspire the other? And yes.
That's a wonderful question. So there is a scholar and author named Aoife Murray, and Aoife wrote a book that talks about the interaction between Dickinson and the household help. It is, if I've got the title right, Emily Dickinson, Maid, M-A-I-D, as Muse. And Aoife was the one who pointed out to me that some of Dickinson's poems are very much like her recipes. So if you look at her like cake recipes or gingerbread recipes, she was the family baker. They often are just a list of ingredients, and some of her flower poems are as well. So there's one poem that starts out, a sepal, petal, and a thorn. And she's talking about a rose. She actually reveals that at the end. Some of you may be familiar with the poem, to make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. Goes on from there. Again, those are sort of ingredient poems. So it's not a direct answer to your question. I don't know that she was baking with ingredients out of the garden. The family did have an extensive vegetable garden, but it was really maintained much more by the hired help as opposed to by Emily and Lavinia and her mother. Her mother grew the figs, we know, and was very proud of those. So I think like the fruit was sort of in between, a little bit of both. And Mr. Dickinson was very interested in the apples.
So this is an unusual question, but is there a way to cultivate Indian pipe?
Is there a way to cultivate Indian pipe? Indian pipe is this little saprophytic plant. It is, it's white, so it does not photosynthesize. It has this symbiotic relationship with roots of plants that it grows near. I do not know a way to cultivate it. You see it growing in certain conditions. I can remember one garden that I worked at, it tended to pop up in the duff, you know, like the needles that fell off of hemlocks, and it was moist. So I'm not sure is the real answer. I checked with the New England Wildflower Society. I can't remember what its name is now, but they would have the best idea. Probably not. I think those are something, it's something that really happens in nature, but you know, I do know, people do cultivate things like shiitake, so it's possible.
So the Indian pipe, for anyone who doesn't know, is well associated with Dickinson because it was on the cover of the first publication of her book's poems, and it was given to Dickinson in her lifetime as a painting by Mabel Loomis Todd, one of her first editors. And when Emily received that painting, she said that it was her preferred flower of life. So if anyone was wondering why the curiosity about that plant, it's another one of those plants that has a deep Dickinson association.
And she did include it in the herbarium. So we know that she was, really familiar with it face to face.
So here's a question. What do you think the fairy medicine is? Is that a cure or at least a balm for death? So,
I think to me, she was just being fanciful. But one of the joys of Emily Dickinson is there are endless interpretations. And the important thing is, what does it mean to you? I think she is very playful often, and that poem is a very playful one. And so, fairy medicine, I don't know.
So did the Dickinsons grow any fruit in addition to figs or apples? Does anyone know how many apple trees they had?
Don't know how many. We have quite a number of the different kinds of apples. Again, just sort of picking through all of the letters and other references that we have. She talks about the sweeting apple. She talks about russet apples. In one letter, she says, Vinny prefers Baldwin's. So we know some of them. We don't know how many fruit trees. The acreage on her father's property was 3 acres. Some of it was flower garden, some vegetable garden. They had a big meadow across the street. There were lots of orchards in the area, and there's some evidence that there was an old cider house on the property. In addition to apples, they grew pears. There was a grape trellis. There's an entry in Lavinia's diary that she said she got up at 4 a.m., picked currants and made currant wine. So they were not teetotalers. What am I forgetting? What other ones am I forgetting?
Those are all the mentions that I can immediately think of.
Yeah.
Their varieties were Winternellis and Tyson pear, I believe, for people who are pear fans. Yeah. So are any of the current plants the same plant from when the Dickinson family lived there? Have any of the plants or trees survived from that time?
There's one that we're absolutely sure of. Well, actually, I'll say 2. So one is the big oak tree that is next to the homestead. It's a white oak. And we know that Austin Dickinson planted that. And there is a nice chain of images, some etchings and then some photographs as time moves on of that tree at various sizes. So it's a really nice thing. We also know Austin was a great planter of trees and also collector of trees. In those days, it was quite acceptable to go out with your wagon and your shovel. And I will say, in the case of the Dickinsons, generally also some hired hands to help dig and dig things out of the woods. We don't do that anymore because, we know that things will get, driven out. But at any rate, he planted lots of different kinds of trees, both native and introduced varieties. One that he planted was a magnolia with these giant leaves. It's umbrella magnolia, Magnolia tripetala. It's very unusual for Western Massachusetts. And while I don't think the original is there, its offspring are. So it still blooms and it will seed, and you see little ones around. So that one was definitely there. In terms of the flowering plants, well, trees flower, but you understand what I mean. In terms of the flower garden, the one that I wonder about is the lilac and maybe the peonies. They both last a really long time. In fact, Emily Dickinson wrote a poem about the lilac as an ancient shrub. They probably were moved after the Dickinson period because the property was owned by another family that did garden extensively. Really, I wouldn't be surprised if they were moved and retained because the Park family were that kind of family. Like, they didn't get rid of the windows and doors from the conservatory, so why would they have gotten rid of lilacs? They just might have moved them.
So what were some of the most exciting or surprising discoveries and insights about Dickinson's gardening life between writing your first book and the newer edition of Emily Dickinson's gardening life?
Well, the first book I wrote was my very first book. And it's 20 years old. And the most amazing thing for me was getting a do-over. I mean, like, how many times in life do you really get a do-over? And so much had changed about Emily Dickinson scholarship and also interpretation. So when I first came to the museum, it was a much smaller place. I think there was one full-time employee. It was basically, it had been faculty housing for Amherst College and fairly recently converted into a museum. And so, things were kind of the way they were. They had been remodeled after the Dickinsons lived there, then faculty lived there. It was always taken, everybody took good care of it, but it just was the way it was. So much has changed in terms of, the library's been restored, the bedroom's been restored, the conservatory's been put back on, her brother and sister-in-law's home next door was joined in the museum. So that was really extraordinary for me to kind of live through that and, continue to participate in the gardens and just meet more people and learn more, because it's almost an endless subject to learn about Emily Dickinson. The Emily Dickinson International Society offers loads of resources and a wonderful journal where you get ongoing scholarship. And there's always something new coming out.
So this is a question I can put to Marta or Brooke. Did Dickinson share pressed flowers in letters?
I'll be glad to take it, but do you want to answer a question, Brooke? Go ahead. Okay. So yes, absolutely. There's not much left in terms of the actual plant material. There is one in the collection of the Boston Public Library that is a set of beautifully arranged pressed pansies, big pansies, not the little Johnny jump ups. We know that she had some roses pressed and included. And there's an interesting connection in the book I'm working on now on the Secret Garden. Its author had lunch at Emily Dickinson's brother and sister-in-law's house. And she wrote a little note that said, oh, my host's sister sent over an unusual poem in a little bed of heartsease, which are the tiny little pansies. I love when I have connections between multiple authors. So that was another way that she would sometimes share flowers, is fresh flowers. She would share little bouquets, nosegays, she called them, or she'd put them on top of gingerbread, little violets and things are edible flowers. So she really did like to share her garden wealth with other people.
Here's a question, another sort of biographical question, and this person wonders about Emily's eye condition and how did she go out at certain times. So maybe we could talk about her love of those night blooming or fragrant flowers.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the eye condition. Emily Dickinson, when she was in her, 30s, 40s, I'm going to look to Brooke and Elizabeth, something like, she started developing maybe iritis or something, that was really bothersome to the degree that she moved temporarily to the Boston area and lived with some of her cousins, and she had ongoing eye treatment. During that time, it seems like she did more gardening in the evening, and it kind of makes sense, right? If you're having eye problems, bright light would bother you. You go out in the evening or at night, and you start to see more nighttime poems, things about moths and owls and things like that. That's kind of where my knowledge ends. If either of you have anything to add.
Okay. I think that answers the question well. And there's a question about the Evergreens gardens. Did the Dickinsons exclusively work on or use the garden, or did they share it with Austin and Susan's at the Evergreens next door? Did the Evergreens have their own garden?
The Evergreens had gardens. It was a different sort of garden in many respects, because Austin had a relationship, a professional relationship with Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, the designers of Central Park. So he and Susan knew them both. They entertained them. Calvert Vaux sent some books. And Austin's property was kind of in that romantic sort of bucolic homestead style. There were lots of trees and shrubs, but there were garden beds. There's a picture of hollyhocks that seems to be in between the two properties. We know that Susan had a lot of roses and other flowers. I suspect, but I have no proof, that Austin's family shared the vegetables out of the vegetable garden, so that the combined properties really just used one vegetable garden. But again, I don't have proof of that. Susan talks about cutting asparagus, I think, in one, but she could have just walked next door. I mean, literally, what is it, 100 yards? I mean, it's not very far. So yes, Susan was a gardener as well. She was also a very accomplished flower arranger. She won prizes, and she was sometimes a judge at the local agricultural fair for the flower arranging categories. And we're sure that they shared. How much, we don't know.
So there's so many great questions. We will need to wrap up soon, but there's been some love for the lily behind you, Marta. So one person wants to know about what it is, and another person would love it if you could describe some of the other historical lilies that she grew. Particularly, do you know if she grew Asiatic lilies?
Do I know if she grew Asiatic lilies? You know, I'd have to look it up, and I'm not going to take time. I know that they grew a lot of lilies. She once received a bulb from a friend, and a lily bulb, if you've never seen one, the bulb itself is quite extraordinary. It's got all of these little scales that are open, and it looks like, I don't know, like maybe a lotus or something. And Emily Dickinson responded the thank you note that she sent, said something like, "I've long been a lunatic on bulbs, but lunacy on any theme is better undivulged." I'm paraphrasing, but anyway, it was a very interesting quote. Her niece writes that they grew Madonna lilies. And I don't know where all of these are from. So I think the Madonna lily is probably native to I don't know, maybe part of Asia, maybe the western side of Asia. They grew tiger lilies, which is an Asian lily, unless they were talking about the native one. She wasn't using botanical names, so it makes it more difficult. I think the really popular Asiatic lilies that we grow now are a little later. Again, I'd have to look up the dates. The lily I have behind me is from Asia. It's from China, and it's a species daylily called Lilium henryi. It's named for a plant explorer named Augustine Henry, who introduced it to Europe from China. And it's, wait a minute, I'll have to tip up my camera, because it's in my garden. It's at least 5 feet tall, and I sacrificed one for scenery today. And I will say, if you're bothered by lily beetle, it's pretty resistant to those little red lily beetles that really make a mess of the regular Asiatic daylilies. Well, lilies, not daylilies.
Yeah, so this is a question from one of our guides, actually. Is there any record of Emily having plant envy, having seen a variety elsewhere and bringing home a specimen to grow? Where would Emily have gotten seeds?
So that question of where did she get her plants, and I'll go back to, did she have plant envy? All gardeners have plant envy, so I guarantee that she did. I'm trying to think if I've got a good instance. It was fascinating to me to try to track down where her plants might have come from. And one thing I discovered was that in the mid to late 1800s, there was a booming mail order business in seeds, bulbs. I'm not sure about plants, but she mentions the Bliss catalog. BK Bliss was a New York seed house, and they had these very lush, they weren't color, but they were still extremely lush catalogs. She mentions that in 1881. There were local seed and nursery vendors in Amherst and surrounds. So I went back through the Amherst papers, which are only on microfilm at the library, and found lots of classified ads for, places on Phoenix Row that sold this kind of seed and that kind of seed. And some of them were flower seeds. So they weren't all just sort of farm seed. There was the agricultural college that comes a little later in her life, but they did sell a lot of plants. And then her father talks about bringing plants. So I imagine her father being out, doing his lawyerly things or being in Boston. And she says it in one very young letter. She says, "Tell Papa to bring the Sweet Williams." So he's getting them from somewhere. And again, there were nurseries at that time. So it's a really, really interesting topic. Now, plant envy. I know that she tried to do things from cuttings because, again, there's some letter that said, the branch resisted all my efforts to root it. So, she was trying to create a plant from a cutting. I can't think of any others. Either of you think of any others? I can't come up with one. It's a really good question. I'll be on the lookout for a plant envy quote.
Yes. So there's a question. Could you speak briefly about Emily Dickinson's study of botany at Mount Holyoke? Or extend that to Amherst Academy, I think.
Yeah, so she started her sort of middle and high school was at Amherst Academy, it was located across from the Jones Library in Amherst. It's no longer there. It was a very, I think, a very good quality education. It was co-educational. They did do some lectures with the Amherst College students. She studied from a book called Mrs. Lincoln's Familiar Lectures on Botany. It was a well-regarded book. It went through dozens of editions. It's still a very interesting book to read. It was particularly targeted to young women. So I don't know whether they split the classes and, did the young girls take botany and the young boys take something else? I don't know. We believe she continued her study at Mount Holyoke. She went to Mount Holyoke at the time female seminary for 1 year. She did, I don't know what textbook. She did not bring her plants because she says, "I'm glad I didn't bring my plants," essentially because the dormitory was too cold. But she was always interested in the science. And if you look through her poems, there are lots of botanical terms that show up, as well as other, there are legal terms if you're a lawyer. The great thing about Emily Dickinson is there's, something like 1,700 poems and 1,000 letters. So there's really something for everyone. Whatever you're interested in, you can find an Emily Dickinson connection.
And here's a nice question. It could be one of our final questions, maybe our final one. Were there any patterns in Emily's flower giving? Did Emily associate certain flowers with Lavinia or Susan, for example?
Well, I know that Susan, she once likened to the crown imperial. Now, a crown imperial is a kind of fritillary, but it's huge. It's a flower that's usually bright red or bright yellow, and it also can be 5 feet tall. It's a late spring blooming flower. And so I think, she really had these she put Susan up on a pedestal for a very long time. They had this really intimate relationship. She shared so many of her poems with Susan. And so I think a crown imperial is fitting. Also, I think Susan was a little imperious, if I may be so bold. So maybe in more ways than one. Lavinia, I don't think of as a particular flower. I do remember that their niece said that Aunt Lavinia's style was that she just let everything run all over. So the nasturtiums by the end of the year were crawling all over everything else, which sounds very much like my gardening style. So I think she wasn't a tidy gardener. She kind of let her flowers do what they wanted to do.
Well, that was a very thorough Q&A, and we still have 13 wonderful remaining questions. So thank you so much to all of you who posed a question. And if you didn't get yours answered, I might suggest that you just hop over to our Facebook page. You could pose it there as a comment on the video that will be saved thereafter of this program. And we at the museum will perhaps endeavor to answer it for you, or appeal to Marta for even more of her expertise and her time. I'm going to go ahead and draw things to a close so that we can stick to the hour that we promised you. We just want to say thank you again so much for tuning in. It means so much to us to see you here, and a huge thank you to our wonderful Marta McDowell, who has been such an important supporter and friend to the museum, and whose vast knowledge, as exhibited today, informs and inspires our work. And a big thank you too to Victoria Dixon, who you did not hear from today, but she continues to also be an incredible supporter of the museum, an incredible volunteer, and we just so appreciate her sharing her beautiful artwork for this program today. If you felt inspired today and are interested in becoming a garden volunteer, shoot us an email at edmprograms@emilydickinsonmuseum.org, or you can visit our website to learn more or to make a donation at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. And be sure to check out our upcoming programs, including a fabulous poetry reading in August and an upcoming book talk by our author, Martha Ackman. And so we just want to thank you again, and thank you so much, Marta. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes,
There's a
question really briefly about Victoria's work, and I did email Victoria before this program, and she said that you could email us and we could put you in touch with her. So if there's anybody interested in that, you can let us know. When we are open, we do sell some of her work in the gift shop, but our gift shop is not open at this time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you all. And thank you for the great questions. I'm only sorry we didn't have another hour to get to them all.
We hope to see you again soon, and please take good care of one another. Have a lovely weekend. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.